Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. It's late at night, and Frank and Joe Hardy have decided to see if their suspicions are correct. And the counterfeiters' lair is in the abandoned old Turner mill. Can they sneak across the moonlit grass to reach the mill before the suspicious Markel finds them? And how can they ever catch the gang of crooks? Here is the thrilling conclusion of the Hardy Boys in the secret of the old mill. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Hardy Boys in the secret of the old mill. Chapter 21. At the Mill. The two boys made good time out into the country, and when at last they reached the abandoned road that led down to Willow River, it was not quite 10 o'clock. As they rode, they discussed their plan of action, and it was agreed that they should leave the motorcycles beside the road at the same place they had left them on the occasion of their previous visit to the mill. "I'd like to have them closer to the river," said Frank, "for we might have to clear out of there in a hurry, but we can't afford to let them hear us coming. And it's a calm night. They could hear a motorcycle for half a mile," opined his brother. They left the machines in the shade of some trees by the roadside and went the rest of the way on foot. They could see quite clearly, for the moon had risen higher, and the gray ribbon of road extended before them. "I wish it had been a bit darker," Joe said. "We'll have to be careful when we get near the place." "They may have posted someone on guard. Oh well, we can look the place over when we get there." At last they emerged on the hilltop that overlooked Willow River. Below them lay the stream, with water shining in the moonlight. The deep banks of willow trees along the borders cast heavy shadows, and a light mist overhung the fields and hedges in the distance. Gloomy and mysterious, the heavy bulk of the old mill rose from beside the river, near the shimmering silver streak of the mill race. Not a light shone from the building, and it appeared absolutely deserted. "Perhaps they've all moved away," suggested Joe. "I noticed that the buildings were all boarded up when we were here last time." "They haven't moved away, never fear." Cautiously, the boys went down the slope. They left the road and kept to the shadows of the trees, skirting the open space of meadow that lay between the grove and the mill itself. They did not speak, for the night was so calm and clear that sound carried for a considerable distance. They could hear the dull roar of the rapids and the waterfall, sounding hollow and lonely in the moonlit night. They came to the edge of the grove and moved slowly about in the deep shadows, the grass sinking beneath their feet. When they had reached a point about 200 feet from the mill, they paused to reconnoiter. "We've got to cross that open space," whispered Frank. "And then what?" "See that willow tree beside the mill?" Joe nodded. "It reaches right to the roof. It looks to be our best bet. If we can climb that tree and drop to the roof or get in a window, we'll be all right." "As long as we can get up the tree without being heard." "We'll have to take our chances on that," Frank said in a low voice. "I think it's going to be harder to cross that open space." For 200 feet, the grassy sward was bathed in moonlight. They could not walk across it without being in full view of anyone who might be watching from the mill. But it had to be crossed, as the mill itself was isolated on the bank of the river, and on this side there was no protecting shade to enable them to creep up closer. "We'll have to crawl across the grass," Frank whispered. "Ready?" "I'm ready." "Go easy and quiet. If you hear a sound, Don't move." They dropped their hands and knees, then left the shadow of the wood. They began to crawl slowly toward the willow tree at the rear of the mill. Inch by inch they made their way forward. The moon was high in the sky and seemed like a giant searchlight. It seemed impossible that they could cross that open space without being discovered. Every blade of grass seemed clearly revealed by the moonlight. When they were about halfway toward the mill, they heard a sound in the distance. It was the banging of a heavy door. There was a warning whisper from Frank. They lay motionless in the thick grass. For a moment, a deep silence prevailed. Then from the mill, they heard a surly voice. "I saw someone out on the hillside." They were startled, but they did not move. Their only hope of safety lay in silence and in remaining motionless. "You're crazy, Markel," replied someone. "There's no one out there." "I tell you I saw someone crawling down through the grass. I'm sure of it. I saw him from that upper window." "Whereabouts?" "Out there, see? Can't you see something dark up there?" There was silence for a moment or two. Then the second man laughed. "Ha, ha, ha! It's only a log." "I tell you it isn't a log. A log doesn't move." "That isn't moving." "It was." "Well, if you're so sure of it, why don't you go on up and see? You're getting so nervous lately that you think people are hanging around here all the time." "I've got a right to be nervous. We're not safe here, I tell you. We should have moved out of here a week ago. We'll never find a place as safe as this." "Is that so? Ever since those two boys came snooping around here and asking Lester questions, I've been suspicious. They've got their eye on this place, let me tell you. They were down at the railway station the day I slipped the package to Burgess, and I'm mighty sure they saw me." "Just a couple of kids. You're too nervous." "Well, I'm going on up the hill and take a look at that log, as you call it." As it happened, there was a log lying in the grass, close by Frank. But he realized that if Markel came up to investigate, he would have no chance to evade discovery. They could not get up and run away, at least not until capture seemed inevitable. Frank's heart sank. They had been discovered before they had a chance to even reach the mill. At that moment, relief came from a most unexpected quarter. A dark cloud that had been creeping across the sky began to obscure the moon, and gradually the vivid illumination that bathed the hillside gave way to gloom and darkness. The cloud hid the moon completely. "Now's our chance," whispered Frank to his brother. "Head toward the willow tree." He scrambled to his feet, and together the boys raced down the slope toward the willow tree back of the mill. Their feet made no sound in the deep grass. They were taking a desperate chance, they knew, for in spite of the cloud that had fallen across the moon, Markel might be able to see them. But Markel had just emerged from the mill, and his eyes were not yet accustomed to the gloom. As the boys reached the shelter of the willow tree, the moon emerged from behind the cloud, and slowly the hillside was again bathed in radiance. Panting, the boys halted beneath the tree and looked back. They could see the dark figure of Markel as he cut across the slope in a diagonal direction, and they watched as he drew near the place where they had been lying. They saw him stop, kick at something in the grass. Then they heard him mutter as he turned away. "Well, what was it?" called the other man from the doorway of the mill. "It was a log, all right," admitted Markel in a disgruntled tone. "But I could have sworn I saw it move a while ago." "Better get your eyes tested." To this pleasantry, Markel made no reply, but trudged on down the slope until he again reached the mill. The boys pressed close to the willow tree. "You may think I'm being too careful," they heard Markel saying, "but we've got good reason to be careful. You know what'll happen to the whole crowd of us if we're caught. Sure, about 20 years in the pen, but we're not going to be caught, I tell you." "Don't be too sure. We can't afford to take chances anyway. I'd rather keep my eyes open and get fooled by a few logs on the hillside than feel too safe and spend the rest of my life behind the bars. I guess you're right. Anyway, everything is all right tonight. I'm going to take a trip around the mill anyhow. Your nerves must be jumpy." "They are," snapped Markel. "My nerves are always jumpy when I think I see something moving down toward here from the woods, and I don't care whether it was a log or not. I saw something move." "Oh, probably a sheep or a cow that strayed from one of the farms. Or even a dog." "Yes, it might have been a dog," Markel admitted. "We'd better get to work. Doc is waiting for us." "I'm going to walk around the mill once anyway." Go ahead, then," said the other man. "I'll be inside with Doc." The boys heard heavy footsteps as Markel left the doorway, and then they saw his dark figure in the moonlight as he came around the side of the mill. They pressed close against the willow tree and lowered their heads so that their faces would not be seen. Both were wearing dark clothes and dark caps. They did not look up, for they knew that their faces would be gray against the surrounding darkness, and that Markel might see them. In an agony of suspense, they heard the footsteps come closer. Markel poked around among the rubbish at the side of the mill. It was plain that he was not yet convinced that he had been suffering from a delusion when he saw the moving forms on the hillside, and he meant to satisfy himself beyond any shadow of doubt that there was no one lurking in the vicinity of the mill. Nearer and nearer he came. His body brushed against the overhanging branches of the willow. He was now only a few yards away from the Hardy Boys. Breathlessly they waited. They stood rigid and motionless, not daring to look up. Markel's footsteps came to a stop. He was standing but a short distance away, listening intently. Had he seen them? Chapter 22. Through the Roof. The Hardy Boys always said that the few seconds in which they stood in the shadow of the willow tree, with the suspicious Markel almost within arm's length of them, not knowing whether they had been discovered or not, were the longest seconds they had ever known. It seemed hours before they finally heard Markel give a grunt of satisfaction and trudge away in the opposite direction. Even then it was long minutes before they dared move, before they ventured to raise their heads and look about them. When at last they did so, Markel was no longer in sight. They heard him go around the other side of the mill, and finally they heard his footsteps as he trudged up into the doorway. The door banged at last. Markel was back in the mill. They breathed freely. "That was a close call," whispered Joe in relief. "Not a sound," cautioned Frank. "They may be listening." They waited in the shadows for a long time, but evidently Markel had given up the search, his suspicions allayed. Finally, a strange sound came from the interior of the mill, a strange whirring sound, followed by the muffled rumble of machinery. "What's that?" whispered Joe. They listened. The rumbling sound rose and fell with monotonous regularity. Finally, Frank nudged his brother and pointed to one of the boarded windows halfway up the side of the mill. A faint streak of light was apparent through a crack in the boards. "That must be where their workroom is," Frank whispered. The sound of machinery in motion continued. "We've struck them at the right time," said Joe in a low voice. "They must do their work at night. We've got to make sure." "How can we get inside the mill?" "The willow tree. We'll have to climb it and drop down on the roof." "What if they hear us? We won't have a chance to get away." "They won't hear us," said Frank confidently. "The walls are of stone. Anyway, the sound of machinery will drown out any noises from outside. It's our only chance to get into the mill." "Lead the way, then." Frank began to ascend the willow tree. It was difficult work, for although the tree was large, it bent and swayed under his weight. It was impossible for both of them to attempt to climb at the same time, and Joe was forced to wait on guard at the bottom, listening as his brother made his way higher and higher among the springy branches. The topmost branches drooped over the roof of the mill, and when at last Frank had reached them, he swung himself over until his feet touched the top of the building. For a second or so he was uncertain of his footing, but at length he was able to stand steadily on the sloping surface. He released his grasp, and the branches swished back. So far he had been able to move with a minimum of noise, and he was confident that his ascent to the roof had been unheard. He called softly to Joe, and in a few minutes a rustling among the branches indicated that his brother was also climbing the tree. Frank waited, and directed his brother so that Joe was soon swinging out from the branches. He dropped lightly to the roof of the old mill. "There should be some sort of trap door here," said Frank quietly. "If there isn't, we'll have to lower ourselves over the edge to one of the upper windows. I noticed a small open window around at the front, but there is probably a trap door." The mill roof was not on an abrupt slant, so that the boys were able to make their way among the shingles without a great deal of difficulty. The roof was in a bad state of repair, and once Frank came across a wide hole where the shingles had fallen off and where the wood beneath had rotted away. But there was no trap door. "We'll tackle that hole in the roof," he decided. The gap was only about a foot square, but when Frank turned his flashlight on it, he saw that immediately beneath them was a sort of attic, the topmost room in the mill. Quietly they began enlarging the hole in the roof. Fortunately, the effect of rain and wind and weather had been such as to render the roof extremely weak. The shingles broke off easily, and bit by bit they made the hole wider until at last it was a large black gap. They did not throw the debris to the ground, but piled it carefully up on the roof nearby. The work of enlarging the hole in the roof had taken them some time, as they worked cautiously and deliberately, with a view to a minimum of noise. Finally they agreed that there was sufficient space to admit the passage of a human body, and Frank began to lower himself through the opening. The attic was very low, only about 5 feet from floor to roof, and when Frank's feet touched the boards beneath, he tested their strength. Having satisfied himself that the floor was strong enough to support his weight, he crouched down, flashing the light about him, in search of some mode of egress to the lower part of the building. He cautioned Joe to wait on the roof. The condition of the building was such that the floor might not be strong enough to hold them both, in which event disaster would overtake them. At first he thought the attic was entirely separated from the rest of the mill. The floor seemed to be solid. There was not the sign of a stairway or opening of any kind. Frank was bitterly disappointed to have been successful so far, and then find themselves in a narrow little room under the eaves of the mill. Suddenly he caught sight of a crack between the boards, and he held the flashlight closer to investigate. He found a space about 2 feet square, evidently a trap door cut in the floor, and he tugged at the edges of this until at length he managed to raise one side of it. Then quietly he worked at the trap door until he was able to lift it out of place. He raised it and put it quietly to one side. It was very dark beneath the opening, and he flashed the light down once for a brief second. It was long enough to show him that a ladder led from the opening to the floor of the musty, unoccupied room below. So far, so good. He whispered to Joe, "All right, come ahead." In the aperture in the roof, he could see Joe's form silhouetted, and then his brother scrambled down beside him in the attic. "I've found a trap door," Frank whispered. "Where does it lead to?" "There's another room directly below us. It's empty. The workroom must be just below that. But there's a door at the far side of the room, and I think it leads to the stairs that run to the bottom of the mill. Shall we go ahead?" "May as well. We haven't been seen yet, nor heard." Frank handed the flashlight to his brother, then groped his way to the trap door. He managed to place one foot on the top rung of the ladder beneath the opening. It held beneath his weight, although the ladder creaked warningly. Cautiously, step by step, he descended. There was the utmost need for silence. From the position of the flash of light that he had seen through the crack in the boarded window, he judged that the workroom of the counterfeiters was about midway in the mill, immediately below the deserted room into which he was now descending. The mill widened out toward the bottom, and Frank judged that the locked stone room on the ground floor and the room above were those used by the men. He reached the bottom of the ladder at last, touching the floor without a sound. He whispered back to Joe, and in a few seconds, a faint noise from above told him that his brother was also descending into the dark room. The rumble of machinery was louder and came from directly beneath his feet. Also, he could hear a muffled murmur of voices. He had not been mistaken. The workroom was immediately beneath. Joe reached the bottom of the ladder in silence. Frank groped for the flashlight. He switched it on. The room in which they were standing was a low-ceilinged, bare chamber, on the far side of which was a doorway that led to a flight of stairs. Frank stepped cautiously over to the door and peered down the stairs. They led to a landing a short distance below, and continued from there to the bottom of the mill. The room beneath the one in which they were standing evidently opened onto the landing. Frank made a mental note of all these features so that he would have a good idea of the layout of the building in case it became necessary for them to make a hurried retreat. He heard a whisper from behind him. He turned quickly. Joe was crouching on the floor, peering through a crack in the boards. He motioned to Frank to come over. Chapter 23. The Alarm. Frank crouched on the floor beside his brother. He switched off the flashlight. The room was in darkness. Immediately he could see a glow of light through one of the cracks in the flooring. By crouching close to the floor, he could see through the cracks into the room beneath. At the sight he saw, he almost gave an exclamation of triumph. There were 3 men in the room, the 3 men of the mill, Uncle Doc, his companion, and Markel. They were standing beside a machine that looked like a small printing press. Their sleeves were rolled up, and they were wearing inky aprons. The printing press was rumbling steadily, and Markel was feeding it with small sheets of peculiar greenish paper. But it was what was heaped on a low table beside the press that particularly attracted the attention of the Hardy boys. There they saw neat bundles of crisp, new bills. They were heaped high on the low table, each bundle in a thin paper wrapper, and their denominations ranged from $5 to $50. "They're printing counterfeit money," whispered Frank. Joe nodded. A tingling excitement possessed them. In spite of the fact that they knew the bills were counterfeit, there was something fascinating in the sight of those hundreds of crisp green bills. Their view of the room was limited, but by moving from side to side, they were gradually able to take in all the details of the little chamber. Above the constant rumble of the press, they could hear the voices of 3 men.
"Once we get this shipment sent out, we'll be on Easy Street,"
said Uncle Doc.
"If we can get it all placed," grumbled Markel. "We'll get it placed all right," said the other man. "We haven't had any trouble so far. Burgess and his crowd have put over their part of the deal pretty well." "It'd be better if they'd stay away from Bayport," said Markel. "First thing we know, they'll be figuring the money is coming from here." "Why should they?" said Uncle Doc. "It's being sent around to the other towns as well as Bayport." "That fool Paul Blum mighty near gave the game away." "He can't say anything. He doesn't know where the stuff is coming from. I think he has an idea we're round the mill, but he isn't sure. He won't give us away." "Just the same," said Markel. "I'll be relieved when this whole thing is over and we can get out of here. This patent breakfast food story is all right for a while, but country people are too curious. The farmers are talking because we won't do any milling for them." "Let 'em talk. We'll be out of here by the end of the week. That last photo engraving you made for us is a good one. It would take an expert to tell it from the original. We'll make $50,000 from that shipment of 10s alone." "It's good enough," admitted Markel, evidently pleased with the compliment. "But I've said all along that our paper is too thin. It should have just a little more body to it. But it's too hard to imitate. The genuine banknote paper is a bit heavier." "What's the matter with you tonight, Markel?" asked Uncle Doc. "You've been nervous and jumpy all evening. First of all, you think you see someone sneaking around the mill. Now you're afraid we're all going to be pinched. By the end of this week, we'll be out of here and living on the fat of the land. This is the biggest counterfeiting deal that has ever been put across in the United States. I'd imagine you'd be feeling pretty proud of yourself. By the time it's all over, we should be worth $250,000 each. All the more reason for being careful. You have to watch your step in a game like this." "And haven't we watched our step? Who would ever suspect this old mill? Why, there's Hardy the detective, living right in Bayport. He's never suspected a thing. And the federal detectives think we have a plant somewhere in the woods back of Barmett Village. It was a good idea to take over the mill, I'll admit. But the sooner we're out of here, the better. Well, the last batch of bills will be run off tonight. We'll clear out tomorrow morning and send down for the machinery as soon as we can."
Frank nudged his brother. So the counterfeiters were planning an early escape. They peered through the cracks in the floor and watched the three men moving about as the press rumbled and bill after bill was added to the pile on the table.
"Easier way to make money than working," remarked Uncle Doc, with a satisfied smile. "I'm going to take a trip around the world with my share," said the second man. "What are you going to do, Markel?" "I'll follow the horses. I'm going to visit every racetrack in America this year. I'll double my money." "You'll lose every cent of it." "No chance." Uncle Doc smiled. "Wait and see. Smarter men than you have lost all their money on the horses."
Frank and Joe had heard enough and had seen enough to know that there was no further doubt as to the nature of the activities of the three men of the mill. They had seen the counterfeiting plant in operation, and from the conversation of the three men, there was no doubt but that this was the plant that had been responsible for flooding the East with spurious bills in the past few weeks. The counterfeiters were evidently running off a last shipment of bills before closing up the plant and moving away. It behooved the Hardy boys to act quickly. "Where will we go when we clear out?" they heard Markel say. "We'll separate," answered Uncle Doc. "We'll meet in New York." "Where?" "We'll meet Burgess at his apartment. You remember the address, don't you?" Uncle Doc gave an address in the 40s, and Frank instantly registered it in his memory. It might come in useful, in case the counterfeiters slipped through their hands. He got up slowly from his cramped position, and Joe followed his example. Frank led the way toward the door that opened on the landing. "We better get out of here," he whispered. "What'll we do?" "We'll go to Bayport for help. We can't tackle these fellows alone." How will we get out? There's no use trying to get out by the roof. We might break our necks trying to reach that tree again. We can go down the stairs, said Frank quietly. And out the front door? It's probably only bolted on the inside. If we can get past the door of that workroom, we should be all right. Come on, then. Frank led the way. He stepped out on the landing. Both boys were wearing light sneakers that made little noise. Step by step they descended the stairs. Step by step they drew closer to the landing that led to the counterfeiter's room. They could hear the muffled sound of the printing press and the vague voices of the three men. They reached the landing at last. A streak of yellow light shone from beneath the door of the workroom. The stairs led on toward the bottom of the mill. Each lad held his breath as he traversed the dangerous distance to the next flight of stairs. Here, if anywhere, they were in danger of being heard. But the low voices within the room continued. The steady rumble of the press went on without interruption. Frank gained the top of the steps. Joe followed. They went slowly down the stairs. Frank could see the dim outlines of the mill machinery in the large room below, with the dark shape of the door in the distance. Once they gained the door, they would be comparatively safe. The thought had hardly crossed his mind when his foot struck suddenly against some solid object. There was a slight noise. The object moved. Then it went clattering down the stairs with an uproar that seemed to awaken the echoes from one end of the mill to another. He had kicked over a pail that had been left lying on the steps. The noise would not be unnoticed, he knew that. With a bound he had reached the bottom of the steps. There was no time to seek escape by the door, for already he could hear someone running across the floor of the workroom above. They must hide, and hide quickly. Joe was close behind him. Frank turned and sped through an open doorway close at hand. The boys found themselves in a gloomy stone room, in which several large pieces of machinery could be dimly distinguished in the faint light. From the floor above they could hear voices. A door opened. Frank glanced back, and he could see a beam of light against the wall by the stairs.
"I'm certain I heard a noise," they heard Markel saying. "I'm going to find out what caused it."
Chapter 24. Trapped. The Hardy Boys could see little chance of escape. Markel was coming down the stairs. They could hear his heavy boots as they clattered on the steps. Frank glanced around the room. There was one window, but it was boarded up. There was but one door, the one through which they had come. Markel had reached the foot of the stairs by now. They heard him give a grunt of surprise as he picked up the pail.
"This is what did it," he called back to someone on the landing. "It fell down the stairs." "Well, what of it?" Uncle Doc called down to him. "Someone must have knocked it over." "Couldn't have been anyone," sniffed Uncle Doc. "There's nobody around. It's just your nerves." "Pails don't fall downstairs unless somebody knocks them over," said Markel stubbornly. "Ask Lester. Perhaps it was him." They heard Markel go into another room. For a few moments there was silence. Then Markel came out again. "He's asleep, or shamming. I didn't waken him. But I'm going to take a look around just the same." His footsteps drew nearer the room in which the brothers were hiding. Frank sprang lightly in behind the open door, pressing himself close against the wall. Joe wedged in beside him. Markel came into the room. He was carrying a flashlight, and its beam illuminated the chamber. The Hardy Boys waited in suspense. Would he think of looking behind the door? Suddenly there was a mutter of disgust from Markel, and a rustle, as something flitted out of a corner. "Meow!" "Only the cat," grunted Markel. The animal purred ingratiatingly, but Markel aimed a vicious kick at the cat. It missed its mark, however, and Markel turned and trudged out of the room. "Find anything?"
called Uncle Doc from the top of the stairs.
"It was only the cat," answered Markel sullenly. "The brute must have been prowling around on the stairs and knocked the pail over." "Well, come back and get to work. I hope you're satisfied now. I knew it must have been something like that."
Markel gave no answer, but went back up the stairs. After a while the door of the workroom banged behind him, and soon the roar and rattle of the printing press broke out anew. Frank took a deep breath. "Whew! That's the closest call I ever went through," he whispered in relief. "Let's get out of here, quick. I'd like to give that cat about a quart of cream for breakfast." They tiptoed quietly out of the room and made their way to the front door of the mill. It was, as Frank had predicted, bolted on the inside, but he drew the bolt and the door swung slowly open. Frank placed his fingers on his lips as a sign for silence. To this, Joe nodded understandingly. Then from a distance came an unexpected sound. The mewing of a cat. Both lads had to grin. Indeed, it was all Joe could do to keep from laughing outright. They slipped outside, closing the door behind them. "Now, to get back to Bayport," whispered Frank. "We'll have to hurry." They sped across the grass toward the borders of the dark wood, and not until they had reached its friendly shade did they look behind. The ghostly old mill stood by the gleaming river, dark and sinister in the clear moonlight. "We'll be back," Joe said, as he glanced back at the mill. "There's going to be a big surprise for that gang before the night is over. I'll say, let's get started on it." They ran up through the trees until they reached the deserted road, where they had left their motorcycles. Within a few minutes they were in the saddles and roaring back in the direction of Bayport. They made the journey at full speed, but at that, it was late before the gleaming lights of the city came into view. The motorcycles sped down the shore road onto the concrete boulevards, then raced through the city streets, now almost deserted, save for an occasional late trolley or nighthawk taxi. At length, they drew up before the Hardy home and raced up the front walk. They found their father in the house, sitting up for them.
"What on earth kept you out so late? Your mother—"
Fenton Hardy began, but Frank interrupted him. "We've found the counterfeiters!"
"The what?"
demanded Mr. Hardy in astonishment. "The counterfeiters! Get some men and we can catch the whole crowd this very minute."
"Is this right?"
asked the detective swiftly. "We've found their plant. We saw them making money. We can bring you there right away. They don't know that we saw them." "And they're getting ready to leave first thing in the morning," put in Joe.
"Where are they?"
demanded Fenton Hardy. "In the old Turner mill on Willow River. We've just come from there." Mr. Hardy was a man who wasted little time once he had grasped the essentials of a situation. Without a word, he hurried over to his study and picked up the telephone. He asked for a number, and after it was secured, he held a brief, curt conversation. Then he put down the telephone, and the receiver clicked. "We'll have a posse out there in half an hour," he said to his sons. 3 state troopers and 2 Secret Service men who've been working on this case are in town. Will that be enough?" "There are 3 in the counterfeiting gang," Frank told him.
"We'll have enough. And now tell me how you found out about the old mill."
Briefly, Frank and Joe told him how their suspicions had first been aroused by the mysterious activities about the mill, how they had visited the place and found that strangers were not welcome, how they had finally resolved to investigate for themselves, and how they had that night gone to the mill and seen the counterfeiting plant in actual operation. Their story was interrupted by the arrival of an automobile, which drew up in front of the Hardy home with a squeal of brakes. A man in uniform stepped out and ran up the walk.
"Here are the officers," said Mr. Hardy. "Come along."
They left the house and met the officer on the steps. Mr. Hardy spoke to him.
"They're at the old Turner mill on Willow River," he said quietly. "I suppose you know how to get there?" "Can't say that I do," said the officer. "Not by car."
follow the shore road, and then cut in on that deserted loop. It used to run right past the mill before the shore road was built." The trooper nodded.
"I remember now. The deserted road, eh? We'll get there all right."
"Better leave the car back on the road some distance and go the rest of the way on foot," suggested Frank. "We can sneak up on him better that way." They clambered into the automobile. The other men were broad-shouldered, keen-eyed fellows with determined faces. The moonlight glinted on rifle barrels and revolvers. Through the cool night sped the automobile, out the shore road, leaving Bayport behind, until at last the car turned off into the deserted road, rocking and bumping to and fro in the ruts. When they reached the place where Frank and Joe had abandoned the motorcycles earlier in the evening, the boys spoke to the driver, whereupon he brought the car to a stop. They got out and stood in a little group in the moonlit road. Fenton Hardy was in charge of the raid, and he gave his orders quickly and with precision. The men were to follow the road until they reached the meadow between the wood and the mill. The troopers were to deploy out so as to come up in the rear of the mill. The Secret Service men and the others were to take the front way. They trudged down the road until at last they stood at the edge of the wood, and they could see the mill below them in the moonlight. Then the three troopers moved off to the right, keeping well in the shade, preparatory to cutting down across the meadow toward the back of the mill. Fenton Hardy, the two Secret Service men and the boys walked boldly across the meadow. They were not seen. There was not a sound from the mill. When they reached the front of the building, they could see the dark forms of the three troopers who flitted across the grass and waited in readiness back of the mill, in case anyone should attempt to escape that way. Mr. Hardy tried the front door. It swung open. He stepped inside. The Secret Servicemen followed. The boys crowded close at their heels. "Which room?" whispered the detective. "At the top of the stairs," Frank told him. At that moment, the door of the workroom opened, and they could see a man run out onto the landing.
"Who's there?"
called out a startled voice. It was Markel. He was clearly silhouetted in the light from the workroom.
"The police," answered Mr. Hardy. "Put up your hands. We have you covered."
In reply, Markel flung himself flat on the floor. There was a streak of crimson, and a revolver shot roared out. Mr. Hardy and the Secret Service men had their weapons ready, and they replied with a fusillade of shots. The light in the room at the head of the landing had gone out. With a bound, Mr. Hardy reached the stairs, then raced up the steps. When he reached the landing, however, he found that it was deserted. Markel had escaped the bullets and had crawled back into the room, for the door was closed. Fenton Hardy launched himself against the door of the workroom, but it did not budge. He could hear sounds of voices, a noise of banging and of running about in the room beyond. The Secret Service men and the two boys reached the landing.
"Break in the door,"
snapped Mr. Hardy. Together they launched themselves against the door, and there was a splintering sound, but still the barrier held. Again! With a concerted rush, they plunged forward once more. The door fell in with a crash. Fenton Hardy switched on his flashlight, for the room was in darkness. There was the printing press. There was the table with the packages of counterfeit money. But the counterfeiters were gone. The window was wide open. They had made their escape that way. From beneath the window came the sound of rough voices, a shot, a loud yell. Mr. Hardy ran to the window and looked out.
"We got him, sir,"
called out a voice. Underneath the willow tree were 6 figures, and 3 of them were troopers. Each man held a prisoner. The counterfeiters had been captured. Chapter 25. The Reckoning. When the full story of the activities of the counterfeiters became known next day, Bayport found that the Hardy boys had succeeded in breaking up one of the most dangerous bands that had ever baffled the federal authorities. After the capture of Uncle Doc and his associates, Fenton Hardy and the Secret Service men had wasted no time. Frank had remembered the New York address of the mysterious Burgess that he had heard Uncle Doc mention, and a telegram to the New York police resulted in the arrest of this man, who turned out to be the brains of the gang, the man who had arranged for the distribution of the spurious bills. The crooks in Barmouth Village and the rascally woman in black were also apprehended. The machinery in the mill, Mr. Hardy told his sons, was the most complete and efficient they could obtain. Markel, it seems, was at one time an expert photo engraver. He furnished the engravings that enabled them to make such an excellent imitation of United States currency, while Uncle Doc and the other man helped him turn out the bills. Burgess saw to it that they got the proper paper, and also planned the distribution. There were enough bad bills lying on that table when we raided the place to have netted them almost $500,000 between them. Thanks to the quick work of the officers, not one member of the gang had escaped. In Burgess's rooms had been found a notebook containing the names and addresses of the agents he had working for him, distributing the counterfeit money throughout the country, and by the next day, every man had been apprehended. The 2 Secret Service men who had aided in the final roundup of the counterfeiters at the old mill called personally at the Hardy home next day to congratulate the boys.
"We've been working around here for almost a week trying to get the goods on these men," said one, "but never once did we think of the old mill. What made you suspicious of the place?"
Frank told him how they had first learned that strangers had taken over the mill, and told of their first visit to the place. "To tell the truth," he said, "my first suspicions were when Uncle Doc offered to give us a reward for helping save Lester from the river. He took 2 $5 bills from his pocket and offered them to us. Then the other man snatched them from him, turned around, and later offered them to us again." The Secret Service man smiled. "Uncle Doc offered you 2 counterfeit bills, and the other man was afraid they would be detected, and that you would know where they came from. I suppose that was his idea, but it made me suspicious. After that, Joe and I kept watching the place, and as everything seemed to indicate that something suspicious was going on at the mill, we made up our minds to pay them a visit."
"And a very lucky thing it was you did. It was a smart piece of work, and I want to assure you that the government won't forget it."
The government did not forget. Before the month was out, the Hardy boys had received a check for $1,000 as a reward for the part they had played in the capture of the counterfeiters. "Enough money," Chet Morton said when he heard of it, "to buy gas for the motorboat for a couple of years anyway." As for Uncle Doc and his gang, they were all sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. Frank and Joe made particular inquiries about Lester, and they asked their father to see to it that the boy was well taken care of. The result of Mr. Hardy's efforts in Lester's behalf was the discovery that Uncle Doc was not the boy's uncle at all, but a rascally impostor who had made claim for the lad at an orphan asylum, and who had planned to bring him up in a life of crime. A well-to-do citizen of Bayport, who heard of the case, offered to give Lester a home and see that he was sent to school. The boy was accordingly assured of a brighter future than had confronted him while he was with Uncle Doc. And no one was more pleased than the Hardy boys. "We'll take you out with us in the motorboat, Lester," they told him. "Will you?" he asked, his face lighting up with pleasure. "Sure. You're one of the gang now." "And will you take me with you when you go detectiving?"
"When we go what?" exclaimed Joe.
"When you go detectiving."
The Hardy boys laughed. "Oh, you mean when we're trying to be detectives. We'll see, Lester. But the chances are we won't have a chance to be detectives for a long while now. Counterfeiters don't start operating around Bayport every day, you know." "And it's a good thing they don't," Joe added.
But the Hardy boys were destined to have other adventures, in which they were to have opportunities of displaying their ability as detectives, quite as timely as those which had fallen to their lot in the affair of the old mill. What some of these happenings were will be related in the next volume, called The Hardy Boys in The Missing Chums. When they received their check, which was the reward for the government for their clever work in running the counterfeiters to earth, they were accompanied to the bank by Chet Morton and Lester, Jerry Gilroy and Phil Cohen, Tony Preto and Biff Hopper, for the Hardy Boys had promised to celebrate by treating their friends to ice cream, to be followed by a motorboat race, wherein Tony, in the Napoli, was going to make a second attempt to beat the sleuth. "I guess $10 will cover it," said Frank, as he handed the check over to the cashier. "We can buy gas with the money that's left over." "And you want to deposit $990? "Yes." The cashier handed over 2 $5 bills. Chet Morton seized one, bit it, gazed reflectively at the ceiling for a moment, then gave it back to Frank. "I guess it's good," he said. "There's so much counterfeit money going around these days that one can't be too careful." The end. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we begin a new book. You can find a link to our podcast on the Marshall Public Library webpage, www.marshallpl.org. I'll talk to you again soon.